double geo method of trellising. So there are two ways you can do it. You can either lay the cane flat along the wire, or you can arch the cane. And the philosophy behind arching the cane is that you're basically tricking the plant to start ripening at its outermost point and at its highest point at the same time. So vines are what's called apically dominant, which means that they start ripening from the furthest point away from their, like core, and then the ripening moves back to the center of the plant, shall we say. So by arching the cane, you're telling the plant that this is the furthest point as well as this is the furthest point, and thus the ripening happens a little bit more evenly.
So what you want in your soil to be elastic, meaning there's enough pores. If you pulverize soil, those rototillers like spin fast, people say, oh, how beautiful, look, it's all like dust.
Yeah.
That settles down, there's no pores.
Right.
So microbes needs pores for oxygen. Also roots needs pores to spread.
Right, yeah.
So it's very important when I say farming is an art, you see why.
Yeah.
You go in Burgundy, once a week or whatever, twice a month, they open bank and there's a stirring rod. Right. They stir it. So what is stir? It's a batonnage. So there's sediment down here that you want to, most of that yeast keep in suspension for 7 to 10 months. Here, so that process maybe works in Burgundy, but oxidizes juice. So we have a very good system. We put, again, barrels on 4 wheels, and whatever we decide, once a week or twice a month, we do this. And we get nice stirring by gravity, much gentler, and no oxidation. Yeah, so it works for us best.
Here, the entire mountain is of volcanic origins, but most of it didn't explode and do big pyroclastic things like some volcanoes do. This was all andesitic material here.
And what
So
is andesitic? Is that an age?
It's the sort of rock that comes out of earthquakes, or not earthquakes, excuse me, comes out of volcanoes. Andesites, obsidian. Think of ripeness in mathematical terms. We'll call this in the middle perfectly ripe. This is underripe, and this is overripe over here. And this is simply the number of grapes or clusters. And in years where really all of this stuff starts off with flowering and fruit set, and in years where flowering and fruit set happens very, very quickly, you end up with a bell curve that's like this, and that's really what you want. In years where fruit set and flowering happen more slowly, you end up with bell curves that look more like that. And what that means is you've got a lot more underripe stuff and a lot more overripe stuff. And one of the reasons that we do veraison thinning, which is the only time we can go out into the vineyard and look at grapes and identify which is less ripe and which is more ripe by the color, we want to cut off this underripe end of the bell curve so that we squeeze everything towards the riper part.
Right.
And that's why we often will cut off the shoulders, is because they ripen a little bit differently. Not always, but sometimes they will ripen differently than the rest of the cluster. And so we're actually trying to get rid of this underripe part and make that bell curve smaller so that everything's more uniform.
The two dominant, well, there's three dominant varietals or species of grapes that are being used. There's Vitis blandieri, Vitis riparia, and Vitis rupestris. And blandieri is the kind of the basis. And then if you're growing grapes down in the valley floor, you're probably using Vitis riparia. And riparia, as you might imagine, was found along a riverbank.
Right.
That's why it's called Vitis riparia. Riparian corridor, and it needs water and it needs deep soil. Rupestris, Vitis rupestris, also found in the Texas area, southwestern United States. Doesn't grow along the riparian area. It grows out in the desert, has a very different root structure, very fine rootlet hairs, and tends to go deeper and brings the water up in the roots in a way that riparia doesn't, which should mean that it is a drought-tolerant rootstock, and we've always all assumed that. And so when we got Phylloxera, we went to 110R, 1103 Paulson, and 140R, 140 Ruggieri. And these are all Ricustris based. And we use primarily 1103 Paulson as the kind of default. In rocky soils, we use 1103 Paulson. Pardon me, 140 Ruggieri. And this year, that block up there I showed you, that's going to be our first block of 140 Ruggieri. I am not happy with the rootstocks that we have. California is arid. We should be using rootstocks that minimize the use of water. Down in the valley floor, they tend to use riparia, which needs water. So they're using a rootstock where they shouldn't need it, and they're using it that requires water. So it's a dumb deal. But once you put your rootstock in, you're stuck with it, hopefully for 20, 30, 40 years. And what I started noticing, I don't know, I started having a little uneasy feeling about 1103 Paulson maybe 5 years ago. And I first planted it in 98. And I see some basal leaves starting to turn yellow sooner than I would like. And we've dry farmed. We start out like here, we have drip irrigation, and we give them, I think of them like kids. We give them as much nourishment and water as we can. We get them to grow up strong and healthy, and then somewhere about age 7 or 6, it's kind of like teenagers and tough luck. You kick them out the door, and you go, adios, dude, good luck. And we wean them off. Okay, we don't just cut them off cold turkey. Every year they get less and less water, and about that 6th year we are able to, or 7th, they're on their own. But we as an industry should be looking at and trying to develop more drought tolerant rootstock. Yes. One of the characteristics of Cabernet, grapevine leaves have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 veins, and this is called the petiolar sinus. And Cabernet and Chardonnay have leaves which we call naked to the basal vein. So this is the basal vein, and there is no leaf tissue there. So all we have to do is find one leaf on a vine, and if it is in this kind of deeply lobed coloring with a little bit of what we call tomentum, peach fuzz on the backside, you're going, aha, Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, if this were more of a maple leaf, not so deeply lobed and a slightly different color, and it had it, then we would go, that's Chardonnay. These are the only 2 varietals that I know of that do that.
Is our first vintage. We started with, I Fiona mentioned it was like less than 400 cases, and we started by pulling the trees off of the hill behind me, and when they did that, they came across 33 rattlesnakes just on this little hill right here, and so they called it Rattlesnake Hill, and they started to tear us down the rest of the property. And I just, the first wines they made, people were going crazy. And the first wine they gave to Robert Parker, he wrote back with a check enclosed for 2 cases and his FedEx account number to ship them. So, I mean, they knew they were on something.
Yeah.
So in 91, they separated the hill and just called it Rattlesnake. and then continue to make the spring up in Cali.